We thank our members, volunteers, and interns for making these forums possible. Since the year former UI student and airliner patron Tom Brokaw was named NBC Nightly News anchor, which was 1983. I also want to note that by arithmetic, that means that the ICFRC is celebrating its 35th anniversary. And we want to express our gratitude to all the many supporters who have made 35 years possible. Those of you who have not yet renewed your memberships for 2018 or 2019, please do so at your earliest convenience. If you would like, you may do so at the back of the hall at the registration table. Our university and community supporters are the University of Iowa's international programs, the UI Honors Program, the UI Public Policy Center, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization. Thanks to them and to today's special sponsors, Midwest One Bank, John Menninger, and Mace and Kay Braverman. We're very grateful to City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, and the U of I Library's digital archives. So it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague in the U of I Political Science Department, Ron McMullen. A native of Northwood, Iowa, he earned his doctorate in political science from the University of Iowa. And that is, of course, all I need to say for you to know that he's very, very distinguished. But maybe I should add a few things. So I'll note that he spent over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, including serving as ambassador to Eritrea. He is currently the University of Iowa's Ambassador-in-Residence. His teaching contributions have been recognized with the Honors Program's Honors Teaching Award in 2015 and the Collegiate Teaching Award from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences in 2017. So we're very fortunate that he has agreed to join us today to teach us about the Baltics, NATO, and Russia. Please welcome Ron McMullen.
Thank you, Bill, and Ed, and sponsors, and everybody who turned out on this beautiful August day to come to what should be a really interesting year of ICFRC meetings and activities. So I think we're off to a good start. I won't want to take us back 35 years like Bill did, but I would like to start by asking, where were you 10 years ago? Do you remember where you were today, 10 years ago? We were probably watching the Beijing Olympics, harmony and fellowship in Beijing. The U.S., Venus and Serena Williams won the women's double tennis gold championship. You might remember Michael Phelps won 8 gold medals in swimming. The American men dominated the hard court. LeBron James and Kobe Bryant were the mainstays of the U.S. Basketball team. And so while we might have been focusing largely on the Beijing Olympics 10 years ago this week, it was also an election year. And we had a relatively, in retrospect, relatively substantive political campaign underway with a senator from Arizona running for president against a senator from Illinois. We also had, we were in the midst of what the Bush administration called the global war on terrorism. We had 32,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan and over 147,000 U.S. troops in Iraq fighting insurgents in those countries. I was ambassador in Eritrea, and Eritrea had just had a short, sharp border war with its neighbor Djibouti, which is where the only U.S. base in Africa is, and so that had consumed my attention 10 years ago. But while we were focused on the Olympics or the election or U.S. foreign policy initiatives, many of us missed a war in the Caucasus region between Russia and Georgia. In fact, 10 years ago today, a Russian tank battalion finally withdrew from the Georgian city of Gori, which it had occupied for about 10 days. The war had started in early August when a secessionist entity called South Ossetia and Georgian military got into an exchange of artillery and rocket fire in this part of northern Georgia, supported by Russia and wanted to be independent. There are two separatist areas of the Republic of Georgia, one Abkhazia, the other South Ossetia. And as this exchange of artillery fire worsened, the military of Georgia tried to retake this secessionist entity, South Ossetia, much like the North tried to reconquer the South in our Civil War to put down this secessionist region. But by doing so, this triggered a military attack into Georgia by the Russian military. And Russian heavy weapons were used. Russian military invaded Georgia. The town of Gori was just 42 miles from Tbilisi. The Georgian military had largely failed to halt the Russian invasion. And it looked like, at least in the middle of August, that the gate was open between Gori and Tbilisi if Russia had wanted to have its armored columns take the capital of Georgia. Now, why did Russia do this? A, they were supporting the South Ossetians for complex Caucasus politics reasons, but also because Georgia, a couple of years earlier, had expressed an interest of joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the Western military alliance that was formed, as some Europeans wag said, after World War II, to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in. And so this has largely, I mean, at the end of the Cold War, it looked like NATO's raison d'etre had come and gone. But as relations between Russia and Europe didn't return to a normal sort of friendly relationship like many people had hoped, NATO was seen by people in Russia as the enemy, and some people in NATO said, well, we need to continue to protect Europe against Russia. And so the strategic reason for Russia's involvement for invading Georgia 10 years ago was this fear of encroaching Western influence and particularly military presence on Russia's border. And NATO and Georgia have not moved towards NATO membership since the war. So what did the U.S. do about this? We were up to our eyeballs in Iraq at the time and did not want to take on Russia in Georgia. And so we did three things. We airlifted the Georgian contingent that was fighting in Iraq. We airlifted those, basically a company of Georgian soldiers back to Tbilisi to help defend their capital if the Russians decided to take Tbilisi. We also sent a C-17 air transport plane full of medicine into Tbilisi airport, and we dispatched a U.S. destroyer to sail into the Black Sea loaded with humanitarian assistance headed for a Georgian port. We could have contracted a cargo ship to do it, but the real reason was to demonstrate to Russia that we would not accept the Russian military conquest of Georgia. Not a very strong signaling in terms of U.S. support for Georgia, but at least it was something. It apparently was not sufficient to deter Russia's active involvement in its immediate neighborhood. And 4 years ago, we saw Russia move again in its immediate neighborhood into Ukraine. After, in the summer of 2014, there were widespread mass protests in Kiev against the pro-Moscow government at the time, headed by Viktor Yanukovych, exactly. Viktor Yanukovych was forced from power, and a pro-Western government seemed to take its place. Almost immediately in the Crimea, a small peninsula in the Black Sea, pro-Russian demonstrations started to pop up in public places. And pretty soon, in front of public buildings and around security assets in the Crimea, there appeared very polite people armed in uniforms and not bearing any insignia, not claiming to be affiliated with any nation. And these eventually were referred to as little green men. I brought a little green man with me today. This was a little green man that I played with when I was 7. And so faceless, nameless, countryless, not readily identifiable with any military. The little green men took control of the Crimea Peninsula, and the government that came to power as a result of the protest held a referendum. And the people were asked if they would like to join Russia or to stay part of Ukraine. And overwhelmingly, the results of the referendum, as reported, were join Russia. And so shortly after that, not only did the referendum say we'd like to join Russia, but then Russia agreed to accept the request of Crimea to join Russia. So now Russia has annexed Crimea. Russia considers Crimea a part of Russia proper. Shortly thereafter, trouble began in the Donbass basin of eastern Ukraine. You can see on this map the darker parts of Ukraine are higher Russian-speaking percentage of the population. And so the area of Crimea, majority Russian-speaking, and in the Donbass region of eastern Crimea, also large majority Russian-speaking population, had a closer affinity with Russia and Russian culture than other parts of Ukraine. What did the United States do regarding the annexation of Crimea and Russians? So the Russian support in eastern Ukraine continues. Several years ago, Russian provided missiles shot down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 and killed 298 people as it flew over the area. What has the U.S. done? The U.S. was one of a co-sponsoring country. First, we took the issue to the United Nations Security Council, clear breach of international security. And because Russia has a veto in the Security Council, that went nowhere quick. So our next approach was to take it to the UN General Assembly. And so the United States and a number of other co-sponsors introduced a resolution in the General Assembly. One of the co-sponsors was Poland, and another one was Lithuania, as well as Ukraine. And this United Nations General Assembly resolution reaffirmed the United Nations international community's commitment to Ukraine's territorial integrity and claimed that the referendum that was held in Ukraine was without validity. So over 100 countries voted in favor of this resolution. As I say, Lithuania was one of the co-sponsors. 11 countries voted against it, including Russia, Belarus, kind of Russia's little brother, Armenia, which has a Russian military base in it, and Russia has provided Armenia support in its ongoing conflict with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Another country that's voted against the resolution was Sudan, for reasons I don't quite know. Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe voted against it, as did sort of socialist revolutionary Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and finally added to the trio that voted against this resolution was Cuba, Syria, and North Korea. Almost all of those countries have also recognized the annexation, legally recognized the annexation of Crimea. The United States and the vast majority of countries in the U.S. hasn't done so. So the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia as a result of this. And one of the interesting developments to come out of this was how Russia did it. Unlike tank columns that Russia employed in Georgia, since in the last 4 years, I used to teach at West Point, and in the last 4 years, the cadets at West Point and military strategists around the world have been pondering how to counter what we call hybrid warfare. The Russians don't use the term hybrid warfare, they call it nonlinear warfare. And again, it involves typically a combination of propaganda, corruption, subversion, diplomacy, espionage, the exploitation of energy and economic dependence, cyber warfare, and irregular military force. So anybody who's a military historian realizes that since the days of Alexander the Great, combinations like this have been employed. But what makes this particularly difficult is the fact that Russia managed to do this with at least a high degree of confusion, ambiguity, and plausible deniability. Were these polite people, these little green men, really Russian troops? Or were they local ethnic Russian militiamen who were volunteering doing this to help their local cause? The Crimea, and in general, was a big success for President Putin. His popularity skyrocketed and perhaps encouraged him, despite the sanctions and other problems that Russia faced afterwards, to think of the Crimea annexation as a success. This notion of hybrid warfare is one that we're grappling with. How do we know when we're involved in it, and what do we do about it? And so this notion of hybrid warfare, Russia, I think, executed to near perfection in Crimea, less so in eastern Ukraine, where it's been more of a linear war as opposed to a non-linear war. So one of the things that NATO as a military organization for collective defense has been grappling with since 2014 is how to respond to potential hybrid warfare attack. And this has been a particular focus of the Baltic countries, used to be part of the Soviet Union, and in many ways the Baltic countries are exposed. And much of the U.S. And NATO's concern about another use of hybrid warfare has focused on the Baltic states, three countries that are members of NATO and members of the European Union. Lithuania and Latvia are about half the size of Iowa, Estonia the smallest. They're somewhat isolated. And we'll talk a little bit about their specific kinds of security risks and threats that they might be under, given the geopolitical dynamics in Northeast Europe this year. So a little bit about the Baltic states. The Baltic states this year are all celebrating their 100th anniversary of independence. In the chaos and confusion that consumed Europe at the end of World War I, and the Russian Empire had all kinds of problems, including the Bolshevik Revolution, Civil War. There were 5 bits of the Russian Empire that broke away in 1918, 1917. The Baltic states were 3 of those, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Finland was another. And another one you will only know if you're an avid stamp collector, and that was the little country of Tuva, which is about the size of the state of Missouri. It's located between Mongolia and Siberia. If you're not a stamp collector, during its independence period between the World War I and II, it issued a whole bunch of really bizarre stamps, rhomboid, diamond-shaped stamps, and other things. So if you're a stamp collector, you might know about Tuva. They're also famous for a singing style where you can sing 2 notes at once. It's called harmonic overtone singing. So if you've ever heard Tuvan singers, I can't do it. Some people here might. It's kind of like, the closest thing I can come to is, can you hum and whistle at the same time? Try that. Just try. I can't, but maybe some of you can. So anyway, Tuva didn't make it. Tuva was re-annexed by the Soviet Union during World War II. And the Baltic states fought for their independence. These are some Latvian soldiers who were in the Russian Imperial Army, but most of the Latvian soldiers changed sides and fought for, here is fighting in downtown Riga, as the Baltic states fought against both the Bolsheviks, mostly against the Bolsheviks, to establish their independence. And so today this is in Vilnius, Lithuania. This is the presidential palace, and you can see LT-100. If you were to see a Baltic stamp this year or talk to a Balt, they are celebrating their 100th anniversary of independence. They haven't been independent for 100 years, but they're celebrating 1918 as their independence. Now, as a former U.S. diplomat, I'm particularly pleased that the United States government never recognized the annexation of the Baltic states in 1940. So they were independent between World War I and II. In 1940, as Stalin and Hitler decided to carve up Poland, one of the annexes to the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was that the Soviet Union was going to retake the Baltics, and in 1940 they did. And so the next year, of course, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union and conquered much of the Baltic states. So the Baltic states saw a lot of fighting during World War II. And after the war, the Soviet Union retook the Baltic states, and Tuva, not Finland for whatever reason. So today, as the Baltic states and NATO are trying to figure out how to counter hybrid warfare, particularly at these three exposed NATO members, they've decided that special forces, as opposed to conventional forces, are the most appropriate response. So this summer, NATO mounted a 13-country special operations warfare exercise called Trojan Footprint, and several thousand special operators from 12 NATO countries and Sweden, which is a member of the EU but not NATO, did training exercises across the Baltic states to be able to work together to head off, at the first signs of any hybrid warfare, head off the threat and nip it in the bud. This summer, Jane and I and our oldest son and his fiance went to the Baltic states. And what I came away with was how different they all were. Oh, I forgot to say, we didn't recognize the annexation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And the United States kept their diplomatic missions open during the Cold War. So had you, in 1970, gone to Washington, D.C., you would have seen a Lithuanian flag flying over their embassy. They called it a legation at that time. And by 1979, they had no support coming from the Soviet Union, which had taken over their countries. The diplomats were getting really old. They were running out of money. They said, we can't physically keep going or economically. So the State Department stepped in, and there was one State Department sort of junior officer whose sort of his fourth profile was to keep an eye on the Baltic states. He said, Latvia has some gold that the U.S. Treasury is holding for it that we haven't allowed the Soviet Union to get its mitts on. So if we can convince Latvia to sell its gold and share with the other two countries, they'll be able to keep their embassies operating. And by the 80s, the diplomats were all in their 80s or 90s, and no new ones could be dispatched from the Soviet Union. So the State Department got Congress to approve a special authorization where these Baltic diplomats could designate their successors, basically from the Baltic communities in the United States. So 1991, when the Baltic states reemerged as fully sovereign members of the international community, we already had their embassies open. So that's one element of U.S. diplomacy that sort of has tickled me for a long time and caused me to be interested in the Baltic states, and was one of the reasons why we went this summer. As we got off the plane in Vilnius, I went over to get the luggage, and there had been a lot of young, buff guys on our plane with short haircuts. And as I was standing by the luggage rack, they were all pulling camouflage duffel bags from the luggage rack, and they were speaking with a British accent. I said, "Are you guys British soldiers?" And they said, "Yep, we are." And what I didn't know at the time, they were probably there for Trojan Footprint, this special forces multinational exercise. We didn't see them, but of course then we wouldn't have, would we? So we didn't run into them again, but clearly in retrospect, that's who they were. They were coming in to help work with the Baltic militaries to counter hybrid warfare. So again, here's Lithuania, the largest, the most populous of the Baltic states. And besides getting to see them and really being fascinated by the Baltic states, it dawned on me how different they each were by their ethnic composition, their history, their self-identity, how they see themselves compared to their neighbors, both Baltic neighbors and elsewhere. And so Lithuania has a very strong Catholic heritage. Relatively few Russian speakers live in Lithuania, and they are staunchly Catholic and actively Catholic, kind of on the same level of religiosity as Poles and the Irish in Europe. I mean, most of Europe is sort of post-religion, but in Lithuania and Poland and Ireland, people still attend church regularly. This is the National Cathedral in downtown Vilnius. And it's odd that the Lithuanians are so Catholic now, because just to step back for a minute, we'll flash back beyond 10 years and even back 35 years. We'll go back to the year 1187, when Saladin's army took Jerusalem from the Crusaders and drove the Crusaders back into a few fingerholds on the Mediterranean. And while the Crusaders in 1187 lost Jerusalem, they kept a hold of Tyre and were soon in the Third Crusade captured Akko or Acre. And at that point, Richard the Lionhearted came. They thought they could retake Jerusalem, didn't, but they got broadened the toehold on the Mediterranean. And there was an order of knights that was formed during the Third Crusade called the Teutonic Knights. They had a much longer name. But it was a military religious order of sort of holy knights, holy warriors, along the same make as the Knights Templar or the Knights of Malta. The Teutonic Knights were drawn mostly from German-speaking areas of Europe. And when it became apparent that the Crusaders weren't going to be able to retake Jerusalem, the Pope Celestine III said, I authorize, so he had all these German knights geared up, ready to go in the Teutonic Knights, but really nowhere to go, because Christendom was not going to retake Jerusalem. And so the Pope in the late 1100s said, I authorize and will bless a crusade against the last pagans in Europe. And they happened to be the Balts, the people living in the Baltic countries. Lots of forests, lots of marshes, inaccessible. And not only was it a crusade on the last pagans in Europe, but it was also kind of a buffer state between then Orthodox Russia and Catholic Europe. And so it was not only a crusade to convert by the sword these pagans living in the Baltic states, but also to make sure that the Catholics of Europe got there before the Russian Orthodox got there. So the Baltic states found themselves squeezed between Europe and Russia as far back as what was then called the Northern Crusade. So for about 200 years, Europe, mostly the Teutonic Knights, sought to conquer the last pagans in the Baltic states. They were largely successful in what today is Estonia and Latvia. But the Lithuanians united under a single strong ruler, king, and were able to resist conquest by the Teutonic Knights, whereas Latvia and Estonia were unable to. In the late 1300s, Poland, which was Catholic, found itself without a king. And they went to the Lithuanian king and said, how would you like to be king of both Lithuania and Poland? And the king said, oh, good idea, I think I will. Said and you get to marry this beautiful Polish princess. And the only catch was he had to become Catholic. Sort of like James VI of Scotland also became James I of England. So England and Scotland shared a king for a while. So Poland and Lithuania did this as well. But the Poles then said, if our king is Catholic, we'll be Catholic too. And so while they were fighting the Catholic Teutonic Knights, didn't matter, they became Catholic. And to this day, being a strong Catholic is part of Lithuanian identity. So just outside the Catholic basilica or cathedral in downtown Vilnius is this sign. And in Lithuanian, it means miracle. And in 1989, as there were revolutions throughout Eastern Europe, from this spot, That's Jane's funny-looking tennis shoe there in the upper right. That was our group. A human chain of 2 million Balts held hands, starting from this spot to Riga, from Vilnius to Riga to Tallinn in Estonia. 2 million Balts showing solidarity, peaceful, organized resistance to continued Soviet rule of their countries. And so it really was a miracle. The Soviets tried to get the Balts to provide some provocation that would allow them to crack down. And the citizens of Lithuania, there were people killed, there was some violence, but they were largely restrained, unified, and they sang. They got together and sang. So here's a picture of some tourists from Iowa outside of a medieval Lithuanian castle built by the Lithuanian king to resist the Teutonic Knights. So while this was largely successful, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the late medieval period was really powerful, it held not only Lithuania, but what's today Belarus, and also Western Ukraine, all the way down to the Black Sea. So while Lithuania had been a power, brick castles wouldn't do much against hybrid warfare today. The concern with the security threat that Lithuania is under has to do with something called the Suwałki Gap. If you look on those of you sitting in the back probably can't see the screen very well, but if you have that map, the little tiny map of the Baltic states, you'll notice a little green or yellow patch of Russia that's on the Baltic Sea. This is the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. That really was Soviet booty after World War II. This had been the part of German East Prussia. Kalinin was the equivalent of the president of the Soviet Union when Stalin ran the Soviet Union. So Kalinin was a Russian communist boss. And so they named the part of East Prussia that they took as part of Russia, they called it Kaliningrad. And today, back during the Yeltsin administration, people thought this can be kind of the Hong Kong for Russia. It can be free trade port, it could be an economic free zone, it could do all kinds of interesting economic things. It has become increasingly a military outpost sought to deny unimpeded access from through the Baltic Sea for NATO forces. So there's a large, Kaliningrad has about 5,000 square miles and 1 million people, but it's very heavily militarized. Russia has moved ballistic missiles that are nuclear capable there. The Baltic fleet is headquartered in Kaliningrad. And should sort of conventional war break out, and nobody expects it to, but there is a 62-mile gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, which is an ally of Russia. And this Suwałki Gap is named for a little town from Poland. It has, I think, 2 paved highways, each of which are 2 lanes. So imagine trying to move an armored division through the Suwałki Gap. All you need to do is blow up 2 culverts there someplace, and the road would be impassable. So a lot of NATO strategists are thinking, what do we do about the Suwałki Gap? And from the Russian perspective, transit across Lithuania to Kaliningrad is a vital interest. Either 1 or 2 trains a day go from Minsk in Belarus across Lithuania to Kaliningrad. Both Lithuania and the other Baltic states are members not only of the EU, but also of the visa-free transit, the Schengen area. And so people from Russia, Russians who live in Kaliningrad, don't have ready access to the Baltic states. So these trains that run through Lithuania don't stop. People don't get off and on. There are restricted access and restricted travel permits that are necessary for people connecting Kaliningrad with Russia proper. So this is the main security threat. Should the Suwałki Gap be impeded, or Russia's transit, rail transit to Kaliningrad be sort of disrupted, it could be problematic. Latvia, the neighbor to the north, has a different set of security concerns, and largely they have to do with ethnicity. About just under 2/3 of people who live in Latvia are ethnic Latvians. There's a large Russian-speaking population. Riga is the largest city in the Baltic states, and under the Soviet economic planning, it was a manufacturing hub. There was a factory, for example, with 10,000 workers that made passenger cars for trains for the whole Soviet Union. And so after the Soviet Union broke up, clearly Latvia doesn't need a factory with 10,000 workers making train cars. And so there's a lot of unemployment, particularly among the Russian-speaking population. And so Latvia's concern is its disaffected Russian-speaking minority. Riga is known for its Art Nouveau architecture. It's a great place architecturally to walk. Here is the Institute of Science and Technology. It was a late Soviet, quote, gift to Latvia, built in the Stalin's wedding cake style. We went up to the top viewing deck, and there were tiles falling off. It was a kind of interesting place. This is the view of downtown Riga. These four large buildings here are the open market. During World War I, those had been Zeppelin hangars. The Germans ran maritime patrols over the Baltic using Zeppelins. After the war, these big hangars were empty, and they were moved into Riga and serve as the central city market. Heroes of the independence struggle feature in downtown Riga. Here's a young woman in traditional Latvian dress. Here's the threat for Riga. This is again an ethnic map of language speaking. We see in eastern Latvia areas where Russian speakers are in a majority. Latgala is that region. The area in the west is called Kurland, largely Latvian speaking. Just one little odd historical footnote. During the 1700s, Kurland was, it's kind of a semi-autonomous, it was called the Duchy of Kurland, and it got into the colonization business. It had a little colony in what's today the Gambia, and also had a colony in the Caribbean. The little island of Tobago, which is now part of the country Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago was a colony of Kurland, later taken by the French or the British. Now it's part of, and the Walt Disney movie Swiss Family Robinson was filmed in Tobago. So the next time you watch that, see if you see any traces of Kurland architecture or anything in Swiss Family Robinson. So the threat in Latvia is the disaffected Russian minority. And it's big, and about 250,000 of people in Latvia who were recent immigrants from, or recent migrants or transplants from Russia are non-citizens, and they are not stateless. They have a non-citizen passport, but clearly are second-class residents. They are not citizens. The mayor of Riga is a Russian speaker. He's got a real populist touch. He was giving a sort of a little interview from his office, and his cat jumped up and began to drink water out of his coffee mug, which made him more popular. He is reported to be in the pay of Russian intelligence, and has been actively campaigning to get the non-citizens unimpeded access to Latvian citizenship. In Estonia, the farthest north country, Estonia is interesting in part because it is the least religious country in the world. I'm not sure exactly why. It also, it has very close ties with Finland, which is just across the Gulf of Finland. Finland, on the 2018 World Happiness Index that the UN puts together, Finland is the happiest country in the world. Estonia is really unhappy. I don't know why. Estonia is, I mean, the Nordic 5 countries are in the top 10 happy places in the world. The Baltic states are kind of in the middle, but Estonia is the bottom of the Baltic states, I think coming in 63. And why Finland is number 1 and Estonia is 63, I don't know. The threat for Estonia is a little town called Narva. You can see it right on the northeast corner of Estonia. It's almost 90% Russian speaking. It's right across the river from, there's the border, that pole is the border between Latvia and Estonia. There's almost no border control. Here's the family walking across the border. In Estonia, this is the university town. This is the Iowa city. It's called Tartu of Estonia. It's a very pleasant place, very prosperous, scenic. This is sort of the equivalent of Tartu's Ped Mall, like in Iowa City, and they put up this National Geographic frame to try to lure tourists to stand up there and get their picture taken, and they were successful in some cases. Here is the town of Narva. Estonia is the taller thing on the left picture. Russia is on the right, this little river in between. A lot of people in Narva would rather be Russian. 90% of the town, again, it's about the size of Iowa City, about 65 or 70,000. And who cares? But Estonia's two major electric generating plants, which burns oil shale, are located just outside of Narva. So should there be trouble in Narva, should public buildings be taken over, etc., little green men appear, Estonia would not only lose this town of 70,000, but also its main sources of electrical power. So let's think about what you did this summer. Might ask that to the president. Well, first he went to, in June, President Trump went to Quebec to the G7 meeting. Now, at the G7 meeting, President Trump refused to sign the joint communique at the end of the meeting. Largely, he was upset with Canada for 270% tariffs on Wisconsin dairy products, etc. He refused to sign the joint communique, which was very unusual. He also said, why isn't, it used to be the G8, Russia was kicked out of the G8, now it's the G7. So why shouldn't Russia be here? It would be more complete if Russia were here. So, our president thinking Russia should be back in this international organization. And he also told two diplomats at this meeting that, according to BuzzFeed, that said, Crimea really was Russian after all because most of the people that live in Crimea speak Russian. Oh my gosh. Imagine if some part of a country is a linguistic minority. Does that automatically make it a part of a country that has a linguistic majority of that language? So that's opening a huge can of worms. And so after June, after doing, maybe saying that Crimea was Russian after all, and why isn't Russia back in the G8, went to Brussels to the NATO summit. And you can see he was out of sync with most of our NATO partners, rightfully said, you're free riders. You need to pay your fair share, which is a perfectly good. And President Trump also signed the joint communique at coming out of NATO, but left somewhat in a huff. He had insulted a lot of our NATO partners, and people were wondering about his political and personal commitment to NATO. Went to see the Queen, and then he went to see President Putin in Helsinki. And while he was in Helsinki, he held an interview with Carlson Tucker of Fox News. And they got talking about NATO and NATO Article 5. And this is what the president said. They were talking about the 29th member of NATO, Montenegro, in the Balkans that had just joined. And President Trump said, Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people. They are very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, we're in World War III. But that's the way NATO, was set up. So people wondered what he meant by this. Clearly, he was thinking, I don't want to get involved in World War III if the very strong, very aggressive people of Montenegro get in a war, which made everyone wonder about the U.S. commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which says that an attack on one member shall be deemed an attack on all of us. And NATO, the Article 5 of the NATO treaty, the 1949 Washington Treaty, doesn't commit states to respond militarily. It says that they will assist the attacked country. So it could be anything from a nuclear strike to a stiff diplomatic protest. So President Trump clearly had some strange ideas about NATO and Montenegro and Article 5. He had a very interesting meeting, and series of meetings in Helsinki, including a 2-hour, what diplomats call 4 eyes, plus translators meeting that nobody really knows what happened. So the concern is President Trump's commitment to Article 5. What happens if something should happen in Narva, or a public protest in Riga or Latgala in eastern Latvia, or if the train tracks that connect Kaliningrad with Russia get blown up in Lithuania. What happens? I'm not saying that Russia might be behind any of these. Some other provocateur, either local or regional or North Korean or Iranian or who knows whom, could do something that would cause tensions to mount quickly. When do we know we're involved in hybrid warfare? Article 5 of NATO has only been invoked once, and that was in 2001 after the U.S. was attacked by al-Qaeda. And the process by which NATO decides whether or not to invoke Article 5, I mean, Article 5 is part of the treaty. It's there. We've already agreed to that. But what actions individual states take is left up to, under the rubric, assist the attack member, can be anything. And there's not a vote or anything like that that decides. Article 5 has already been agreed upon by NATO members. So it's really interesting. The Baltic states have a really colorful, interesting, and diverse history. They're a fun place to visit. I would heartily recommend it. People were very welcoming. It was scenic and historic and a delightful place. You may want to see it soon. Spring break in Estonia could be just the ticket. It could be really interesting. So I don't have any strong solutions or recommendations. It's a concern, something that U.S. diplomats and U.S. policymakers are grappling with, how to counteract hybrid warfare. What's Russia up to today? I think today yesterday a new set of sanctions. We have a whole web of sanctions on Russia, starting from before their annexation of Crimea. Last week, Art got me to teach a one-week intensive workshop for incoming honor students. And because we had been to the Baltic states this summer, it was on this topic. And we had the students do a very realistic Council on Foreign Relations simulation on a potential hybrid warfare attack on Latvia. And as these incoming brilliant young scholars were debating what the U.S. should do, there was a diplomatic message from Russia saying, how about if we cut a deal? And one of the students said, well, maybe to get them to back off of Latvia, we could recognize the annexation of Crimea. And I said, but what if that was the objective in the first place? They've won. We've just handed them what they were after. So it's a really interesting web of relations between our president and President Putin, between our countries. The Baltic states have been this buffer zone in between the West and Russia for centuries. And it's really a fascinating series of countries. And I wish the Baltic people all the best. They deserve to have a happy, peaceful, and prosperous and democratic future after suffering so long as pawns of great powers. So thank you very much, and I guess we'll have questions.
Great. Well, the first one asks you to extrapolate. What, if anything, does the Russian approach to Georgia and Ukraine teach us about what we might expect in the conflict in the Balkans between Serbia and Kosovo, given it seems that political negotiations have placed the potential annexation of parts of North Kosovo to Serbia on the table right now?
Yeah, that's a question that Russia always raises. Why does the United States recognize Kosovo, which unilaterally seceded from Serbia, and yet doesn't recognize Crimea's secession from Ukraine? And the answer is that it didn't happen in the midst of genocide. The United States rarely recognizes secessionist entities prior to the mother country recognizing them. So only after Addis Ababa recognized Eritrea did the U.S. do so. Only after Moscow recognized the 14 new countries that split out from the Soviet Union did the U.S. do that. So the rule of thumb is we recognize South Sudan only after Khartoum did. But in the case of Kosovo, and Iowa is Kosovo's sister state, that we are on the very edge of genocide. And so to prevent the genocide and to support Kosovo, the United States took that step. Another interesting wrinkle in that is the the Serb Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which rather than be looped in with the Bosniaks and Croats in Bosnia, they would like to join Serbia. So they also say if Kosovo could leave Serbia, why can't the Serb Republic leave Bosnia and join Serbia? And so when Russians ask about, well, why Kosovo but not Crimea, the answer is genocide.
Here we have a request that you comment on a very interesting social science hypothesis. The reason the Finns feel happier than the Baltic countries is that in the winter campaign of 39-40, they bloodied the Russian army.
Well, they were happy about that. And so that was the origin of the weapon, the Molotov cocktail. Molotov was the Russian foreign minister, and so as the Finns ran out of anti-tank artillery, they filled a bottle up with gasoline or other flammables and would ski up behind a pine tree and then throw that at a Soviet tank. But the Finns lost the war. I mean, the Finns sided with Germany, and the Finns lost the war, but they made the Soviets pay a high enough price to retake parts of Finland that the Soviets didn't want to tangle with them after the war, and the Finns, unlike Tuva or the Baltic states, managed to maintain their independence. So I don't know. Maybe it's this. We did have saunas in the Baltic, so I don't know why. Why some countries are happier than others is a mystery. I don't know.
Okay. Comment, please, on given Russia's historic fear of encirclement by hostile powers, was it extremely or needlessly provocative to formally include the Baltic countries in NATO?
Perhaps so in retrospect, and it was completely contrary to a promise that the first President Bush made to Russia, that there would be no eastward movement of NATO. There was. Are the Baltic states glad to be in NATO? Yes, they are. And the collective defense that NATO provides is attractive to countries who might be threatened, like Montenegro. Kosovo would love to get into NATO. So the Balts are probably glad they're in. But certainly Russia does not approve. We saw it as a strategic reason for the Russian-Georgian War in 2008. And the Russians are not happy that part of the former Soviet Union, part of what had been the Russian Empire for over 200 years, is now an active member of an alliance arrayed against it.
Some of the newest NATO countries look to be militarily indefensible by NATO without the use of nuclear weapons. Would it be better if the United States limited its commitment to defend to the original NATO members only?
Estonia, the Estonian military thinks it could hold off a conventional attack from Russia for about 2.5 days. They think that Tallinn would fall within 60 hours of a Russian attack. Estonia and Lithuania have renewed military conscription, as has Sweden, interestingly. Latvia doesn't, in part because it would mean that 1/3 of the new conscripts would be Russian speakers. Perhaps, I don't know. But clearly, the pane of glass strategy, where you have a small group of soldiers or people training or advisors with a potential victim of a Russian attack, means that if Russia breaks that pane of glass, they have to be aware that there will be some consequences of that. Would it be a nuclear attack? No. Could the United States intervene militarily within 60 hours to defend Tallinn from a concentrated Russian attack? Probably not. But there's enough ambiguity in what NATO's response would be to give pause. It's part of deterrence. You don't know. Would the United States and NATO mount a substantial counterstrike against Russia, either in the Baltics or elsewhere, if Article 5 were invoked for a Russian attack on the Baltic states? So no, we can't defend them conventionally, but we have to have that sort of that uncertainty about our reaction to provide a deterrent for straightforward Russian aggression in the Baltic states, or Montenegro for that matter.
What are the Baltic states' relationships with Belarus? Has Belarus ever been seen as a threat, a security threat?
Belarus is a real new country. It doesn't have much of a track record. It's been very close to Russia for a long time. It voted, as I said, it voted with Russia in the General Assembly against the Ukrainian resolution. Relations between Belarus and Lithuania are pretty good. Vilnius is real close to the border. One of the things I try to do is to set foot in as many countries as we can. I've been to 109, some of them just fleetingly, but we were so close to Belarus when we were in Vilnius. I said, let's just take a train this afternoon and go to Belarus just to say we've been there. We didn't, but there's lots of traffic, commerce to and from. Belarus is largely very friendly with Russia, but still has good ties with Lithuania for the time being. If the chips were down, nobody in Lithuania is counting on Belarus to come to their aid or be of any help at all.
Well, I think we shall conclude our program at this point. I want to thank Ron McMullen once again for a wonderful presentation. Let me thank again our sponsors, the University of Iowa International Programs, the U of I Honors Program, the U of I Public Policy Center, and the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their generous support. And today's special sponsors are Midwest One Bank, John Menninger, and Mason K. Braverman. And thanks again to City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. Ron, I think you know what's coming, and I always have great faith that when I reach down, there will be what I'm looking for here. Ta-da. As a small token of our appreciation for your presentation today, please accept this Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug, and please covet it. Thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.